One of my coworkers recommended a book to me about Earl Weaver, the legendary manager for the Baltimore Orioles. It's written by John W. Miller. It's entitled The Last Manager: How Earl Weaver Tricked, Tormented, and Reinvented Baseball. And as far as baseball books go, it's pretty interesting. And if you're a baseball fan, I think you'll find it enjoyable. If you're a Baltimore Orioles fan, probably doubly so. I grew up rooting for the Orioles. The first baseball game I ever went to was the old Memorial Stadium. My father took me there when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. He was in the military, stationed in Fort Meade, Maryland. And I think it was the last season for Memorial Stadium. And Memorial Stadium that setting plays prominently in this book about Earl Weaver. My dad also took me to Fenway and the old Yankee Stadium. So those are memories with my dad I won't forget. So this book chronicles the life of Earl Weaver. And I had heard of Earl Weaver, but I never knew that much about him. In fact, I was just at Camden Stadium last year and was out in the outfield, the picnic area there, and there was a statue of Earl Weaver, a short, diminutive guy. And so I said, I know he was a manager for the Orioles, but I don't know much more about him. And apparently he was pretty foundational to a lot of changes in baseball. If you've read the book Moneyball, which is a good baseball book, I've read that years ago, and there was a movie made about it starring Brad Pitt. But that book talked about how the game changed to being stat-driven, probability, statistics, and, general managers, cerebral general managers making decisions based on on-base percentage and statistics, and not the old-fashioned way of just scouts watching a player and determining whether or not he'll be able to make it in the big leagues. But apparently Earl Weaver was ahead of his time in that regard, and he was managing based on probabilities and statistics, and he would do strange things with his lineup and try to not break the rules necessarily, but see how far he could bend them in order to benefit the team. So he was a very shrewd manager and kind of one of the managers who changed the game. Now, but his story is pretty interesting. He was born, I think, in 1930 in St. Louis. He grew up around baseball. Not that his dad wasn't a baseball player, but they were hustlers trying to make do. I think might have been during Prohibition, and they were trying to find ways to make money, and they would do laundry, I think, for the St. Louis Cardinals. And so young Earl Weaver would get into the clubhouse and see some of these great baseball players on the St. Louis Cardinals. And so he ended up playing baseball and made it to the minor leagues. And one of the threads running through the whole book is that Earl Weaver never made it to the major leagues. And it's something that he had to deal with. And even some people would give him a hard time, some of his players, because he was a very energetic and controversial manager. But he never played in the major leagues. So he made it to spring training one year with the St. Louis Cardinals Major League Club, but this is spring training, so the preseason, and he had a great preseason. Even though he was, like I said, of small stature, he had a weak throwing arm, he played second base, but he would hustle, he loved the game, he understood the game, he had a big mouth, but he was having a great spring training. But back in that time, this was in the 50s now, the managers were also players, so they were player managers. So his manager was also a second baseman, and the manager had to decide between letting Earl Weaver come on to the St. Louis Cardinals, which would mean that the manager wouldn't be able to play. So the manager decided in favor of himself. Earl Weaver went back to the minor leagues and never made it back to Major League spring training, and of course never made it to the Major League. So that's a big part of this book. And it reminds me that, most people, well, first of all, just talking about baseball, most minor leaguers will never make it to the major leagues. It's a very small percent that make it to the major leagues. And many of those guys play maybe a few games, a year or two, and then they're done and they never come back. And that's how it is with most things in life. Most people are not going to make it to the elite level of whatever they do. Most of us will not be famous. We won't have books written about us. Which, it's funny that Earl Weaver then did become famous, but we'll get to that in a minute. But most of us are just going to have ordinary lives, and I think that's a good thing. Especially when you read books like this, especially with Major League sports and baseball, the season is so long. you realize that the toll it takes and on so many of these guys, and not all of them, but most. I mean, Earl Weaver, he was in the minors for, I don't know, playing 15, I don't know how many years he played, but then he became a manager, and he was kind of young for a manager, but he spent decades in the baseball system. And his first marriage fell apart. I think he had a child from that marriage, then he got remarried, and he wasn't around those kids. And one part of the book talks about his son and the struggles he had, and that his dad, Earl Weaver, wasn't even there for him to rebel against. And so he got into trouble, and eventually I think they were able to reconcile, but that's the nature of that lifestyle. And so I don't think it's something we should really be envious of. It's something we should thank God in many ways that we have ordinary lives, and we ought to focus on those things that we take for granted. The time we have with our family, with our children, because it goes quick. And that's actually one of the reasons Cal Ripken Jr., who's mentioned in this book, that he grew up, his dad was a baseball player, manager type thing, and he grew up not seeing his dad that often. So when Cal Ripken Jr. retired, his kids were around 8 or 10 years old, and he said, I'm not managing, I'm not getting involved in any of this stuff because I want to be around to see my kids grow up. So that's commendable. So Earl Weaver never played in a Major League Baseball game, and he became a manager at a fairly young age, and so he did have to deal with that, take jabs at the fact that he's coaching but never played. But whether or not that helped him or hurt him, I don't know. I mean, he was a small stature, and some say that his fieriness and his attitude, and I'll get into the legendary arguments with the umpires, that was a compensation for his height or for his failure to make it to the big leagues. But the guy knew baseball. In fact, one of the interesting stories in the book is that this was after he retired. So he coached from like 1969 to 82, right before, so he won one World Series, and then right when he retired the next year, the Orioles won another World Series in 83. And then he came back for one season. But then after that, I think it was EA Sports was making a video game, and it was apparently the first commercial computer sports game. This was on a computer that allowed players to simulate an entire season without showing each play on the screen. So you could simulate the season. So this would later lead to, there's baseball simulations and of course fantasy baseball and all these things. But this was the first kind of realistic baseball game, and it was called Earl Weaver Baseball. I think it may have been EA Sports. And the book talks about how at the time they wanted to make a football game, but they realized we're not ready for this. Football has 22 people on the field, 11 on each side. It's very complicated. Let's start with baseball. It's maybe a more linear approach. You have 9 position players, 9 fielders, right? And then you have 1 batter and at most 3 people on base. So let's try to make a game based on that, and then we can move later to football. We know we want John Madden. He's kind of the guru on football when we make our football video game, but we need someone to help us with the baseball game. And so who'd they think of? Earl Weaver. He was the John Madden of baseball. And so he goes in there, and I think it's his 2-day training session with these computer gurus, these computer geeks, where he's explaining everything about the ins and outs of baseball in order for them to make this baseball game. And it ended up being a big success. So that was an interesting part of the book about that, his involvement in the baseball game. Let's see what else. So he was legendary for his tirades and going nuclear on these umpires. At one point, he took out a rule book and tore it up and threw it all over the field because he said, "Hey, you umpires aren't following this anyway, so what do we need it for?" And on another occasion, and you can find this video on YouTube to this day, a news crew had mic'd up the umpires for a segment before the game to talk about how the umpires get ready for a game, but the mics were still hot when the game started. And in the first inning, there was a balk call against one of the Orioles pitchers, and Earl Weaver comes out and just goes ballistic on this umpire. And there's vulgarities, profanity, left and right, these two going back and forth. Earl Weaver do you think he's done? He starts walking back to the dugout, and then he comes right back to this umpire. I think the umpire was Bill Haller. If you search it on YouTube, you'll find it. And what happened was the news crew, they were getting ready to pack up, and the mics were still hot, and they're like, oh, wait a minute. Someone was like, we need to film. You guys need to keep filming this. Earl Weaver is going at it with an umpire. And then after the game, the Orioles or Major League Baseball tried to get they told the film crew, hey, give us that footage. We don't want that getting released. And the news crew was like, there's no way you're getting this footage. This is gold. We are keeping this. And so I think whether it was the Orioles or Major League Baseball, tried to sue the news crew, but they lost because they had given permission to the news crew to record the umpires. So that went viral, as it were. And Earl Weaver was a vulgarity-filled, energetic, someone obsessed with baseball. And it reminded me, at least the aspect of his shenanigans and what he would do. I mean, putting on a show, it reminded me of the scene in Gladiator where Maximus is, I guess he's somewhere in Africa, I don't know, his first gladiatorial arena, and the slave master, Proximo, I think was his name, is talking to Maximus about how to win his freedom, and he tells Maximus, if you win the crowd, you'll win your freedom. And Maximus says, I'll win the crowd, I'll give them something they've never seen before. And of course he goes on to defy the emperor. And that's like Earl Weaver. Whether or not he was just bitter about not making the majors, or it's just his personality, maybe a little of both, or it was him realizing, if I can win the crowd, I can be a manager. And amazingly, people went, even in the minor leagues when he was a manager there first, people went to see baseball games because Earl Weaver was managing. He won the crowd, especially in his home, Baltimore, the home crowd. That they'd love this guy. They would love to see him come out and argue with the umpires, and they would go nuts when he would get out there, and it was entertainment to see Earl Weaver argue with the umpires. So he was shrewd. He understood if he won the crowd, he would have a job, and he did for a long time. He had some serious longevity with the Orioles. I mean, but it was the stuff that he did was, I mean, today it would not fly. I mean, he got into fisticuffs with some of his players. I mean, him and Jim Palmer and him and Rick Dempsey would go at it, and I think there were times one of the two threw a bat at the other, and tables flipping and fighting and arguing and cursing, but what pretty much to a man all his players would say, but Earl Weaver never held a grudge. So there's a lot of things about Earl Weaver that aren't commendable, not necessarily a role model, and I'll get to here in a minute his views on Christianity. But one thing that I think is certainly commendable is that it was said of him that he never held a grudge, and he approached his baseball managing as a business, and in that sense I think that he always wanted to win, and if you were the best player that he had, you would play no matter what he thought about you. He didn't hold a grudge against you. No matter how much of a fight you got into the day before, the next day it's business as usual and focused on winning. So he was a very interesting character. And once the ownership at times was pretty embarrassed about him with some of the stuff he did and some of the audio that was leaked and just the coarseness of this guy. But he was a winner. And he kept winning, and so they kept bringing him back and letting him manage the team. And he was the manager that insisted really that Cal Ripken play shortstop, which obviously was a brilliant decision instead of leaving him at third base when he first came up. But speaking of that, there was this other player named Bobby Bonner who was the shortstop during one spring training or when Cal Ripken was coming up. And so Bobby Bonner was supposed to be this great shortstop, and then Cal Ripken was going to play third. And Bobby Bonner was an outspoken Christian. And so I wanted to play two clips from this book and just provide some commentary on them. The first one is taken from two segments. I put them together, talking about Bobby Bonner and his interaction with Earl Weaver and also with Cal Ripken Sr., one of the other coaches, as it relates to Christianity. And then I have another clip to play after that where the author talks about Earl Weaver's beliefs. So first, listen to this one about Bobby Bonner and his evangelism in the clubhouse, and then we'll listen to another one. So take a listen.
In a brief 1981 call-up, Bonner batted .296, .310, .370. Good enough to earn him more playing time in 1982, if he could just escape the wrath of Weaver. Part of the problem was a culture clash. Bonner had embraced evangelical Christianity after a wild youth of parties, cocaine, and LSD. On a road trip back from a speaking engagement, Bonner was stuck in a snowstorm with Cal Sr. When the crusty old coach expressed his desire for a drink, Bonner lectured him for an hour about how Jesus could save him from alcoholism. Rip just stared ahead the whole time, said Bonner. He never said a word. Farm director Tom Giordano threatened to fine Bonner if he didn't stop leading team Bible studies, although when the Orioles had a prospect who seemed to be falling prey to the nightlife, they asked Bonner to counsel him. On a flight to Seattle during the 1982 season, Earl and his coaches were drinking. Earl called Bobby over to ask him about his Christianity. Bonner, come back here. We want to talk to you. Bobby walked over. Bonner, you think you're better than I am, don't you? No, Skip, I don't. As a matter of fact, I'm the chief of sinners. I'm the worst, and God saved me. Nah, you just think you're so good. You're so uppity up. Then the manager launched into a sermon of his own. Let me tell you about this Jesus thing, said Earl. When Jesus was on the cross and he was dying, and he said, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they're doing. And that means when I get drunk, God forgives me anyway, because I don't know what I'm doing. What do you think about that? Bonner then lectured his manager about Jesus Christ. And as he walked back to his seat, he thought to himself, well, I'm never going to play again. He was right, but it was mostly his own fault. In 1982, Bonner batted .169, .198, .234 in 84 plate appearances. Weaver enjoyed playing the Socratic gadfly. One of the most frequently cited Earl Weaver quotes is his reaction to outfielder Pat Kelly's admonition that his manager should walk with the Lord. Earl's classic reply, I'd rather you walk with the bases loaded. On the last day of 1983, spring training, manager Joe Altobelli called Bonner into the clubhouse. You're taking this Jesus thing too far, he told Bonner. Joe, he lives in my heart, so he goes where I go. Well, he ain't going to Baltimore. After the 1983 season, another year in the minors, Bonner quit playing baseball to devote himself to missionary work in Africa. Earl just destroyed that kid, said Hank Peters. Weaver later professed remorse about how he treated Bobby. He and Bonner didn't speak for 24 years until they were both invited to a party to celebrate Cal Ripken Jr.'s election to the Hall of Fame in 2007. I thought Bobby was a really good shortstop, said Ripken. Things just didn't work out. Bobby walked over to Earl. Hi, Earl, it's Bobby Bonner. Bobby, don't you hate me? No, Earl, I love you. He gave Earl a hug, and Earl hugged him back. I don't have any bitterness, said Bonner. I played with the best baseball players in the world. And he was never jealous of his famous rival, whom he respected as a superior ball player.
So I really enjoyed that section of the book, and I enjoyed that character, Bobby Bonner, who was an outspoken Christian and got into it with some of these managers. And I love the part where 20 plus years later, they're reunited, and Earl Weaver's like, Bobby, don't you hate me for the way I treated you and not giving you an opportunity in the big leagues? And Bobby Bonner says, no, of course not. I don't hate you, Earl. I love you. I thought that was awesome. And that's the Christian response. You're not going to be bitter, especially about baseball, right? That's not, life is much more than that. So I found that encouraging. What's not encouraging so much is Earl Weaver's view of Christ and Christianity. Anytime you hear someone say things like, well, Jesus died for sinners, so I'm just going to keep on sinning, that is a very dangerous position to be in. And I have one more clip to share where you get a little more insight into Earl Weaver's view of Christianity. Seems like what we might consider a cultural Christian in some ways, but and there again, there's definitely some commendable aspects, but you're also, you hear stuff like that and you're very troubled. And I'm sure you know people in your life, I've spoken with people who have that view. You know, Jesus died to save sinners, so I'm just going to keep on sinning and he'll keep forgiving me. And the Christian is to be one who is broken over his sin, who is, repentance is a sorrow for sin and a change, not a complacency in our sin. And so that was troubling. But Bobby Bonner wasn't the only Christian. I don't think he lost his job, as the author there mentions, because of his Christianity, because there were other outspoken Christians that did end up playing longer for Earl Weaver. And I don't think Earl Weaver was the type that would, simply because of your outspoken Christianity, not give you the opportunity. He wanted to win. So if Bobby Bonner was playing well and was helping the team win, I think he would have had a long major league career. But he ended up getting into missionary work in Africa, and I think he might even still be doing it to this day. So I just found that really interesting. I love it when you're reading these books about whether it's sports or anything else, and you get an insight into the religious views and Christians that are being faithful to Christ and just how that interacts. I find that fascinating in any book. One more clip I want to play on Earl Weaver's view of Christianity, and then we'll wrap up.
Weaver said he did not go to church, but was raised Lutheran, went to Sunday school for 9 years, and prayed every day. He called himself a Christian. That, he said, was why he didn't carry grudges. I can't live with hatred inside of me, he said. That's what I learned. I ain't afraid of dying either. He told Playboy he believed in the Apostles' Creed and that Jesus was the Son of God, but added that he didn't think Christianity clashed with reincarnation. There are so many religions, and everybody interprets the Bible differently, he said. Earl sometimes attended Kelly's chapel services. Pat had been a reborn Christian for 2 or 3 years, and he wanted to get everybody on his side in 10 minutes. I don't know why, but I always teased him. One afternoon before a game, Weaver walked in on Kelly reading the Bible. Kelly was a terrible base runner. Pat, can you find a chapter on base running in there? Kelly closed the Bible. Earl, when was the last time you had this book open? Not since the start of the season, Weaver confessed. When was the last time you got down on your knees and prayed? Last night, when I gave you the steal sign. Kelly, not amused, told Weaver, you're going to hell. You'll never get to heaven. They went at it until somebody yelled, give it a rest, and they quieted down. Once, seeing Al Bumbry heading to chapel service, Weaver said, take your bat.
All right, so there you get a little more insight into Earl Weaver's view of Christianity. Again, someone who we might consider a cultural Christian. Raised Lutheran, says he believes in the Apostles' Creed, says he believes in Jesus, but then he says things that, make you think that he's questioning the exclusivity of Christ and Christianity. So pretty concerning. Obviously, I don't know the state of his heart, but that kind of reveals this guy was, if he was in a church, that was one of the things I mentioned. He's not attending church. He's maybe going to some chapel services, giving the Christians a hard time. Would this man, if he was in a faithful biblical church, I think he'd either have to come to terms and own his profession of faith, or he'd be removed from the church. And that's one of the reasons that church membership, being involved with other Christians, is so important, because then you don't get these situations where you have these people who are claiming Christ. Or, I'm not saying it solves the problem, but it's one of the things God has instituted to be a safeguard against something like this. That if Earl Weaver was a Christian, it reminds me of 1 Corinthians 3:15, that says, if anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. And I don't know Earl Weaver's heart. That's really not the point. But he is a type, because there are thousands of people like that who do not appear to be walking for the Lord. They're giving Christians a hard time. They're kind of mocking Christ's sacrifice, saying, well, I'm just going to keep sinning because Christ died for me, but I'm a Christian. But, other religions, they're not that different. Obviously the vulgarity and the profanity, and that could be another discussion, but some concerns, again, but it's hard. I guess he was challenged by some of his players, and it doesn't seem like he really changed his position. But a bit of an enigma, this guy, Earl Weaver. An enigma, an interesting character, definitely. And in that sense, the book was an interesting read. And if you're a baseball fan, I think you'll find it interesting. Earl Weaver was definitely not a boring character, not a boring man in his life, not a boring character to read about in this book. Sort of a bittersweet life, though, you think. A lot of success, ended up becoming a Hall of Fame manager. But me left thinking, but how much did he lose with his family? One marriage, second marriage, the relationship with his kids. What did he give up to get in the Hall of Fame and have a statue of himself at Camden Yards. I don't think it's worth it. And that's a lesson I think we can take, or we should think about. And also his views of Christianity I found very interesting. So anyway, that's the book, The Last Manager. If you're a baseball fan, I think you'll find it interesting. Check it out. Again, language warning in this book, because the author quotes Weaver at times, and I mean, it's probably your standard fare baseball language back in the 70s and 80s, but Earl Weaver didn't hold back against these umpires, and he won the crowd. He won his job, and he made it into the Hall of Fame. And interesting read. So check it out if you like baseball. All right, talk to you later.